record this, right?
Be live on YouTube. So does that mean we won't see any?
There we go.
So we will not see anybody come up through Zoom, like their little box with their name in it?
Nope, no, you can't see any, they can see you, but you can't see them, or you can't hear them, but they can chat through you in the box. All right, I'm gonna start it in 2 seconds.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar series. If you missed the first one, you can actually go to our website, MidwestInjuryPreventionAlliance.org, and there is a tab with the MIPA webinars, our webinar series. The first one was Marijuana and Teenage Driving Risks in Illinois, presented by Dr. Dale Ritzel. So there's a slide deck there, as well as a recorded video. And then I am so happy to announce today that we have Dr. Jeff Bridge with us, who will be presenting on the epidemiology of youth suicide and suicidal behavior. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Morgan Sprecher. I am the president of MIPA. And if you know anybody who is interested in joining our organization, feel free to reach out to me or Laura or anybody else on the communications committee. And then they can also sign up on the website as well. So with that, I will hand it over to Gary, who is going to present Jeff for us.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Gary Smith, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Jeff Bridge. I've known Jeff for many years, and I can tell you he's a nationally known researcher and expert in his field. He's an epidemiologist. He's director of the Center for Suicide Prevention and Research at the Abigail Wexner Research Institute at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. He's also the Nationwide Foundation Endowed Chair of Innovation in Behavioral Health Research. He's also a professor of pediatrics, psychiatry, and behavioral health in the Ohio State University College of Medicine. His research focuses on the epidemiology of suicide and suicidal behavior in young people. He also focuses on neurocognitive vulnerability to suicidal behavior, screening for suicide risk in medical and school settings, and improving the quality of care for suicidal youth. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Jeff Bridge.
Thanks, Gary. I appreciate the introduction. I'm delighted to be here presenting today. So let me share my screen. And all right, there we go. Let me move this out of the way. Okay, so just some formalities, my disclosures. So I receive research grant funding from the National Institute of Mental Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And I am a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of Clarigent Health. So what I thought I would do today is the talk is going to have two parts. First part is going to be an overview of the epidemiology of youth suicide and suicidal behavior, primarily among youth in the United States. The second part of the talk is going to be about the association between the release of the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why and suicide and suicidal behavior among young people. So to begin, let me orient you to this slide. So this slide is showing suicide rates among young people in the US aged 10 to 19 years from 1999 through 2018. The red bars represent the number of suicide deaths, and the blue line represents the suicide rate. And one of the things that you can see here is that between 1999 and 2007, there was an 18% decrease in the suicide rate. But if you look from 2007 through 2018, there was an 88% increase in the suicide rate among young people. To put this in a different perspective, so if you think of the problem of youth suicide, in 2007, suicide was the 11th leading cause of death for all ages among people in the US, but the third leading cause of death among young people. There were more deaths from suicide than 2 leading causes of medical causes of death combined. If we flash forward to 2018, suicide is now the 10th leading cause of death, 2nd leading cause of death for young people. And there are more deaths from suicide than 20 leading medical causes of death combined. When we look at the pattern in males and females, it was similar but a little different. When we look at the data from 1999 through 2007, there was that decrease in both groups. 75% increase in the rate of suicide among male youth, 147% increase among female youth in the US. We know, let me orient you to this slide. So what this slide is showing is suicide rates age adjusted between males and females aged 10 to 19 for the whole period, 1999 through 2018. Suicide rates in males are 3 times higher than females, represent almost 80% of all young people who die by suicide. But as I'm going to talk about a little bit more, there's a gender paradox, a sex paradox with suicide, in that female youth attempt suicide at far higher rates, about 3 to 4 times higher rates than males. And we can talk about that a little bit more. So let's flash forward and let me orient you to this slide. So this is a slide from Dr. Donna Roosh and our research team. The upper part of the figure shows suicide rates over time from 1975 through 2016 among males, represented in blue, and females, represented in this sort of gold yellow color. What you can see here is that there was a gap. The gap was, this is looking at the ratio, the difference in suicide rates between males and females. And you can see that the gender gap was widest in the early 1990s, and then that gap started to decrease. And so what we wanted to do is to do a paper to examine how those trends have changed over time. So here, this will take just a little bit of explanation. So each of these figures represents data collapsed from 1975 through 1991, 1992 through 2006, and 2007 through 2016. And what's being compared here are the incidence rate ratios between girls and boys, essentially, boys and girls. And what you can see here is that the gender ratio, this is 3, 1 would represent no difference, that the rates are equal in both males and females. What you can see over time among white non-Hispanics is there has been a general decline in the gap. And so there's a narrowing in the gender gap. For Black youth, it's more of a curvilinear, where it widened in this middle period, but then came back to about roughly 2. Same pattern for youth of other race. And then among Latino or Hispanic youth, the data aren't available prior to 1990, and so that's why it's not shown. But you can see that it's almost approaching 1. So the rates are almost equal in young males and females. Now we're going to switch to the method of suicide, mechanism of suicide. And there's a different pattern here among males and females. What we can see among males is that firearms, represented in blue, represents almost half of all suicide deaths among young people, followed by hanging or suffocation, and then much lower rates of poisoning or other methods. For females, there's a different pattern. The females who die by suicide, the largest proportion is by hanging or suffocation, then followed by firearms and poisoning, and then lastly, other methods. And if there are any questions, I don't know the protocol, but if anybody has a question you want me to stop, if somebody is able to get that question and reach out, I'm happy to answer questions as well. So moving on with the epidemiology, what this slide represents is suicide rates in the United States broken down at the state level. And states in red represent states with the highest suicide rates. States in dark blue have the lowest suicide rates, and light blue and yellow are intermediate. What's evident here is that Alaska and Mountain West states have the highest suicide rates in the country. And there are different theories for why this might be. One theory is access to lethal means, access to firearms might be higher in these regions of the country, but also access to care. It is much harder to access mental health care in several of these regions in these states than it is for some of the more populated populous states. Okay, switching again to suicide rates here are presented by race, and this is showing the earliest 10-year period and the more recent 10-year period. And there's a consistent pattern when you look at the data by race ethnicity. American Indian, Alaskan Native youth have the highest suicide rates compared to any other group. When we look at these data presented by broken down by males and females, a similar pattern occurs in that males have higher rates than females. But remember when I talked about there being higher rates among males? It's not universal, because in this age group, American Indian, Alaska Native female youth have about a 35% higher rate of suicide compared to Black and Asian Pacific Islander males. When we look at ethnicity, rates of suicide tend to be higher among non-Hispanic youth compared to Hispanic youth. And that's being shown in both males and females. But of note is that the difference is greater, as you can see here, in males than it is in females. Okay, switching gears again. I know we're covering a lot of ground here. If we think of suicide among children, so children less than age 10 in the United States, if you were to look over a 20-25 year period, there's never been a year prior to this past year where there have been more than 10 deaths by children under the age of 10. And in this last reportable year, which is 2019, there were 12. But what is noticeable from this figure is that suicide rates increase with each year of age throughout adolescence. It's much more of an exponential increase for males as it is to more of a linear increase among females. So we know that suicide rates have been increasing in the US and have been for some time. And several years ago, a local reporter called me because there was a death of a young girl in our region and our county. She was 8 years old who died by suicide. And the reporter wanted to know how common that is in children. And I said pretty much what I just said, information from the last slide. But it got me and it got our team to thinking about, well, maybe we should look to see if there's been any change over time in suicide rates among children. Well, I'll be honest with you, I didn't think we would find much, just given how rare suicide in children is. But we decided that we were going to investigate this. So we used data from 1993 through 2012. And this slide right here, the data, it's so rare that we had to collapse across 5-year intervals. We're presenting rates per 1 million persons just to come up with whole numbers. And for overall, there's really no difference in the suicide rate over time. There was no difference in what this slide is showing are period trends. We're just looking at incident rate ratios. No difference, as you can see, across age, across sex, across ethnicity. It was when we came to race where we saw a difference. And what this slide is showing right here, it's comparing suicide rates among white and Black males aged 5 to 11 years during this time period. And we found an overall difference among Black youth, but it was driven primarily by differences in white and Black males. What we had also found is that there was a decrease in the suicide rate among white youth, driven primarily by decreases in white males. But again, remember, males, boys have higher suicide rates than girls. And so no real difference in the incident rate ratio comparing Black and white youth in the earliest period, incidence rate ratio of almost 2.7 in the more recent one. We did a follow-up study to this study. And so let me just orient you to this. So we were interested in looking at suicide in elementary school age children. So by definition, we ended our age range at 11. We weren't expecting to find this potential racial disparity in suicide among children. And so we investigated looking at from 5 to 17, because we know that suicide rates are higher among white youth compared to Black youth in mid-adolescence and throughout the lifespan. So we did this analysis, and what we found, so this is just presenting incident rate ratios, and it's basically showing that in addition to suicide rates being higher among Black youth compared to white youth through age 11, that's also true through age 12. And in our analysis, but the pattern changes at age 13 and the rates are lower relative to the rates in white youth. This is a pattern that appears for both males and females. So we found a consistent pattern with this age-related racial disparity. And this, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show this. This is basically showing how, as a cause of death, the suicide rates have increased even more so among Black youth over time. I'm going to go through this very quickly. This is basically showing, this was a study that if we're looking at suicide rates among 5 to 11-year-olds, there was a 14.7% annual percentage increase in the suicide rate that occurred from 2012 through 2017. So suicide is becoming more of a problem among children in the US. When we're talking about non-fatal suicidal behavior, like suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts, remember I mentioned that there was this gender or sex paradox. Females have higher rates of thinking about suicide, making suicide plans, attempting suicide, and making suicide attempts that require medical intervention. When we look at the data broken down by race, ethnicity, we see a different pattern. What we see is white non-Hispanic youth tend to think about suicide more often, but in the most recent data, Black youth in the US had higher rates of attempted suicide. And a really an excellent paper that conducted by Michael Lindsay and his colleagues, including Ariel Sheftal and our center. Without going into all the details about this slide, what Dr. Lindsay and his team found is that while rates of suicidal thoughts and planning had decreased over time, there was one group, Black youth in the US, where there was an increase in attempted suicide. And among Black males, there was an increase among suicide attempts that required intervention. And so these are all these are very concerning trends. Finally, what I'd like to touch on here, and I know that I'm going through the data quickly, and I'm happy to, and I'm trying to do that so we have time to talk at the end.
Hey, Jeff, if you would like lean close to your mic, you're cutting in and out just a little bit.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, so I'll stay closer to my mic. What I'm showing here are data from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, 2019 data that's comparing suicidal thoughts and behavior among youth who identify as heterosexual, youth who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and youth who indicate that they're not sure. And what we're able to see here is that youth who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual have the highest rates of thoughts and behavior. What's interesting, and certainly an area for more research, is that youth who aren't sure, who aren't able to indicate sexual identity at this point, their rates are intermediate between youth who identify as heterosexual and youth identifying as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And finally, when we look at these thoughts and behaviors among youth by how they define the sex of their sexual contacts, the youth who have had any same sex have higher rates of the behaviors across all the thoughts and behaviors. So now what I'd like to do is switch gears and talk about the association between the release of 13 Reasons Why and suicide and suicidal behavior in the US. So I'm going to go through this quickly as well, a lot to cover, but want to identify specific ways that 13 Reasons Why deviated from best practices in media depiction of suicide, and why does that even matter? Describe some recent studies looking at these associations, and then highlight some recommendations for improving media content while reducing suicide risk. So for those who aren't familiar with 13 Reasons Why, 13 Reasons Why, it was a teen novel written by Jay Asher in 2007. It was the story of a young girl, Hannah Baker, who dies by suicide after she had struggled with depression and despair brought on by betrayal and bullying of her classmates. And so she details the 13 Reasons Why on audio cassettes, and the story basically takes place in an evening, which sort of follows the thread with Clay Jensen, who in the Netflix version of 13 Reasons Why is one of the main characters. The difference between, there are similarities, certainly similarities between 13 Reasons Why, the book, and a lot of differences in terms of how the Netflix series changed some content, added some characters, added scenes. They basically took each of the 13 cassettes and made that into an episode with a storyline behind it. And it often followed the spirit of the book, but it deviated in several ways as well. And so when 13 Reasons came out, it first aired on March 31st, 2017. And if you're familiar with Netflix, the way it works is that when they release a series, they release all of the series, the whole show. So if somebody wanted to watch all 13 episodes in one sitting, that is possible. The series did not adequately address issues of mental health and suicide. The depiction of the lead character's death by suicide was intentionally graphic. So if you look at the producer's comments, they wanted to show a very gruesome death because in their mind, that would prevent future suicide deaths. It depicted suicide as a means of coping with psychological pain. That is something that could trigger suicide in young people, especially those who identify strongly with the lead character, Hannah Baker. The adult characters in the series, for the most part, were portrayed as incapable of helping, insensitive at the most needed times, and or unaware of what was going on. So what is suicide contagion? Well, suicide contagion is the process by which suicide-related behaviors spread quickly and spontaneously through a group. The concern here is that young people, particularly those with underlying vulnerability, are most at risk of engaging in this type of behavior. If you were to look at suicide rates in the United States, it's relatively uncommon, but it's occurred many times throughout time. But it's probably up to about 5% of all suicide deaths would be related to contagion of some sort. So what elements increase suicide contagion? Now this comes mainly from media print, like newspaper reporting, etc., but a front page exposure of suicide death. Think of Anthony Bourdain's death. Think of Robin Williams's death. Think of other people's death, and think about where you remember seeing the reporting of that. Repetitive reporting of the same suicide. Detailed descriptions of method or location can increase risk. When there's this romanticizing or glamorizing of the suicide or its function, that increases risk. And then simplifying suicide to a single cause. I'm sure many of us have seen headlines that say bullying caused child to take own life, statements like that. And then stories that just replay and relay common suicide myths. Now, there is some science out there that shows that proper reporting, positive messaging can actually reduce risk. And that's called the Papageno effect. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into this, but there is a whole science behind positive messages, stories of showing a character who masters a crisis, doesn't resort to suicide as the only means or as a means, that's associated with positive outcomes. So the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, excuse me, I'm just looking to see my time, has come up with national recommendations for depicting suicide. And so here, I just put here the recommendations, and then the X's represent how 13 Reasons Why really would have failed on these issues. So convey that suicide is complex and often caused by a range of factors rather than by a single event. Show that help is available, didn't occur in 13 Reasons Why. Portray characters with suicidal thoughts who do not go on to die by suicide. And then avoid showing or describing the details about suicide methods. And we know just how graphic that depiction was. And that graphic depiction goes against every media guideline for preventing suicide. So just to give a little background, so I'm an epidemiologist, and excuse me, I got my start working at a clinic in Pittsburgh called Services for Teens at Risk, STAR Center. And I started working there in 1987. And David Brent was the director then, and he's the director today. And in May of 2017, there was a 30-year anniversary. And so colleagues from around the world gathered in Pittsburgh for a couple-day conference to talk about suicide and our own research. But one topic that kept coming up again and again and again was the issue of 13 Reasons Why and suicidal behavior. And a lot of people, myself included, were talking about how we had seen an uptick in our hospital systems of teens coming in a crisis, and they were talking about watching or binge watching 13 Reasons Why. And this was a common theme across a lot of researchers and clinicians from various places around the globe. And that got me to thinking that I would want to see if the release of that was at all related to suicide in the US. And I know there are folks on the call who use or on the webinar who do work using National Violent Death Reporting System data, who use national mortality data. And so what I did is I just put a note on my calendar for December of 2018, because that's typically when the previous year's mortality data are released by CDC, to take a look at the data and see, in fact, if there was any association. So in the meantime, in 2017, so shortly after 13 Reasons Why came out, Ayers and colleagues published a paper in JAMA Internal Medicine, And it was a very clever research design. They looked at Google Trends to search for suicide-related terms after the release of 13 Reasons Why. And they compared it to expected search volumes through April 18th, 2019. And they stopped there because Aaron Hernandez had died by suicide on that day. And so there was a lot of media attention around his death. And so they went through the first 19 days. What they found is that the cumulative volume increased 19% for those first 19 days after release. And that reflected somewhere between 900,000 and 1.5 million more searches than expected. And the searches, the queries, seem to suggest both searches related to risk and searches related to possible prevention. And so just to put this, the numbers here aren't important. They're basically showing the data that there is this increase in volume over time. What I wanted to show is the 5 highest increases. So there were searches for suicide songs, teen suicide, at the actual term, how to commit suicide, suicidal thoughts, and then a more protective term, suicide prevention. So this paper came out in 2017. And one of the limitations of this very clever study, but they're unable to assess whether any search query actually preceded an actual suicide attempt. So what I thought I would do is just show a timeline here. So in 2017, there was the Ayers paper. Kim O'Brien and her colleagues wrote an editorial associated with that paper. That was it for 2017. 2018, there were several papers that were published. And I thought what I would do is just focus on 2 of them because they're of interest to this topic right now. The first one was published by Hong and colleagues in Psychiatric Services. This was out of University of Michigan, Emergency Department. Small study, there are limitations with the design, but what they did is they recruited 87 youths. Half the sample viewed at least 1 episode. 84% of those viewed the show alone and were more likely to discuss the show with a peer than with a parent. This isn't surprising if you understand teens and mental health and sharing of things. This is not at all surprising data. 51% of those individuals believe that the series increased their suicide risk. And having a stronger identification with Hannah Baker, the lead female character, was strongly correlated with this belief, R of 0.6. Youth with more depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation were more likely to identify with the lead characters and report negative affect. The next paper looked at suicide attempts, so non-fatal death, but suicide attempt admissions from one children's hospital before and after the introduction of 13 Reasons Why. So this was a study by Cooper and colleagues published in Journal of Adolescent Health. They had 775 records in their analysis, and their target age range was right in that sort of sweet spot of the target age range of characters in 13 Reasons Why. And most were female. And so that's hard to follow. So I'll just tell you what the finding was. Even after the investigators accounted for this underlying trend, the model that best fit the data indicated an increase in observed or actual suicide attempts, admissions, self-harm admissions over what would have been expected following the release of 13 Reasons Why. So let's flash forward to 2019, and there are 3 papers that I'd like to highlight here. So the first one is going to be our paper. And so I mentioned about waiting for the data. So in December of 2018, I would check CDC Whiskers and Wonder every day to see if they would post their data. Actually, you have to do that through Wonder. For monthly data. So I had looked at all of the suicide rates. I just plotted it from 1999 through 2016. And one of the things that is apparent here, so remember, rates are going up. So this sort of orangish peach color is 2016. And you can see that the rates are higher, but there's a general seasonal pattern to youth suicide, and this is very well established. So rates tend to be higher in the spring months, and that's often associated with school stressors and other factors that are affecting young people. Rates drop in the summer months, and then they begin to escalate again in the fall and later fall months. When we overlay 2017 data on top of this, and remember 13 Reasons Why was released March 31st. If you just eyeball the data here for April of 2017, the number and the rate of suicide is higher than if you had looked back 20 or 30 years. There was never a month where the rate of suicide would have been higher than this. And these rates appear to be higher too, but again, no statistics. This is just looking at raw data. So my team published the first paper that looked at the association between 13 Reasons Why and suicide rates in the US. And let me orient you to this slide because we use several different analytic approaches to do this. We utilized time series analyses, and this is called Holt-Winters modeling. So basically what you see here is the blue dots represent the actual monthly suicide rates. The red line indicates the underlying trend. All of this accounts for both the underlying trend and the seasonal effect. So you have to take that into account with suicide. We modeled the data in several different ways. Our primary analysis wanted to look at the effect post-release. So we started with April. These dashed lines represent 95% prediction intervals. So if you think of a confidence interval, these are by definition, they're a little bit wider because you're predicting something out. And then blue dots again, observed. These are the estimates that would have been generated from the underlying trend. And you can see overall higher rate in the first month and actually in some of the other months. That finding was persistent for males. For males, there also was this increase right in March as well. And we can talk about that because Netflix heavily promoted the series at the beginning of March. There's debate in the field about whether that alone could actually be enough to trigger higher rates of suicide. And the other issue is that there was no increase in suicide among females. And we, in particular, we thought that suicide rates would be increased overall. That was our hypothesis. We thought, based on all the prior papers, based on knowledge of contagion effects, that it would be young females that would be more likely to identify strongly with the lead character, and they would be at even higher risk for suicide. We did not find that in our data. Now, our data was limited to 10 to 17-year-olds. We capped our age at 17 because that was the age of the lead character. So that was a priori decision that our team made. So we didn't find effects overall. We did another series of analyses without going into a lot. Basically, it replicated our findings. We did control analyses. So we looked at older age groups, found no association with the release. We had control outcome, homicide, no association. So overall, our main findings were that we found a significant increase, especially in that first month following the release. The rates remained elevated in 2 subsequent months above the forecasted rates. We estimated that there were an additional 195 suicide deaths between April and December over what would have been predicted, and there was no association in older age groups. Am I doing it on time? Okay, good. Shortly after our paper was published, there was another publication that came out probably a month later by an independent team. And the similarities in our analyses are striking. So they focused on 10 to 19-year-olds, and then their comparison, they also had comparison groups of 20 to 29-year-olds and 30 years or older. They did something that I thought was incredibly cool, which is they looked at public interest in the series to inform their decision of how they were going to look at their forecasts over time, and whether observed and predicted meshed or were different. And so what they did is the public interest in 13 Reasons Why, based on Twitter and Instagram accounts, peaked in early April, and it began to decline by June. And so that's how they modeled their data in the first 3 months. What their team found, and they looked again at 10 to 19-year-olds, they found an overall increase in the suicide rate. They found that there was also an increase in suicide rates among girls, so 21% compared to the 12% in boys, which is what one would hypothesize. They also found an excess number of deaths in that 3-month period. Excuse me, I didn't mean to do that. And they didn't find any increase in their older age groups as well. So then there was another study published by Mark Sinyor and his team. He was also an author of the Niederkrotenthaler paper, but they looked within Toronto and found similar results. Sort of a quick summary of that paper. So there was a lot that happened in between the publication of our papers and what happened on July 16th, 2019. I'm happy to talk about some of that, but I didn't want to make it a formal part of the slides. I'd rather have time for questions. I was fishing in northern Michigan, and my phone kept ringing, and I'm like, normally I shut down my email when I go away on vacation, and I looked at the phone, and it was from a colleague, and she said, can you believe what Netflix did? I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And she said, look at the news, Netflix decided that they would delete the graphic suicide scene from 13 Reasons Why. And so it's no longer a part of the series. And this was the quote in the New York Times. I would say there's much more involved to it than that simple summary of after a study. There were several studies and conversations and other things that happened, I think, that moved Netflix to remove that scene, but we could discuss that as well. So some recommendations: 13 Reasons Why violated established best practices surrounding portrayal of suicide. Recommendation is that vulnerable youth really should not watch the show, even with the deleted scene. It can be a very activating show. I know for myself, I mean, I'm not a young person, but I'm watching this. When I sat and watched it, I couldn't, there was no way I could have been able to binge watch it. It just was such an activating show. So vulnerable youth, definitely not watch. If children who aren't vulnerable want to watch, it really is something that the parents and the child should do together. There should be conversations around this. Talk openly about issues with suicide, about mental health. We're really trying in the field to get these conversations much more similar to the conversations we have about physical health. So that's really important for all of us to keep in mind. And it's important for parents to become educated about warning signs of suicide, talk with their children about these issues, and it clearly does not hurt to ask. So there's some good guidelines for reporting on suicide. There's one put out by the American Association of Suicidology, and there's also the recommendations for reporting on suicide. There are others as well, but I put those up there as two references. And there's also a really good book for comprehensive resource for suicide prevention in schools by Erbacher, Singer, and Poland. So with that, I just want to thank you. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to present. And I think that leaves us with 15 minutes for conversation. So I know I went through it quickly, but I'm happy to start having that conversation right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. That was absolutely excellent. Thank you. So we'll have folks enter their questions into the chat room. And Jeff, if you have access to it, feel free to look at those and answer those directly, or I can look at them and relay them. While we're waiting, I was going to ask one, which probably would be an entirely additional lecture to answer this question, but could you discuss a little bit the role of social media in some of these upticks in teen suicide that we've seen?
Sure, great question. So one of the things about social media is it's very difficult to quantify the role of social media and suicide. So one of the best ways to do this clearly would be if we had access to young people's means of social media, which is most often their cell phones. And I'm aware of one study that hopefully, this is a colleague at the University of Pittsburgh, that hopefully will get funded to actually look at this in more detail, because in a public-private partnership, she and her colleagues have been able to test a means where young people who have attempted suicide are willing to have information from their phones downloaded to a secure server. We could do a case control study and compare the social media content in the weeks, days, hours, minutes before a suicide attempt with the same information from consider it a matched control group. And so it's one early step to really get at the heart of this question. And I think the problem with our other means of assessing social media use is that it tends to be self-report, tends to be descriptive, that we don't have these objective measures. And it's so easy to say, oh, I don't look at that content. I'm on my phone for 30 minutes a day, when maybe the complete opposite is true. So I would say that the field is still very young in terms of understanding those relationships, those associations. But I think we are taking a big step forward by looking more at these objective types of data.
So I don't see any other questions in the chat room. I'm going to ask one additional one then. The seasonality of youth suicide that we see, where it goes up during the school months and decreases during the summer, that's obviously been discussed for a long time. Have there been specific factors that have been identified that show up during the school year? Is it bullying? Is it the stress of schoolwork? What is it? Because, in some ways you would think increased socialization, maybe being at school, may be helpful, but clearly something else is going on here that's a negative effect.
Yeah, and I'm not aware of any specific study that's looked at that, at that level of detail. It's a great question. But I think to your point, about school and socialization, if COVID has taught us anything, with students, there are some kids who benefited in the sense that kids who might have been bullied, who might have been experiencing anxiety or depressed mood in relation in part to going to school, whatever that pressure might be, whether it's social anxiety or the actual bullying or the bullying type behaviors, to be removed from that setting could be a good thing for them. In theory, though, it also could continue. If there's an underlying vulnerability, then they're not having this opportunity to work at the coping skills, the core mechanisms, processes for dealing with these issues, and so they're losing out on opportunities to thrive as well. So it's a great question. I just don't think it's been looked at quite in the level of detail that that you're suggesting. But it would be fun to think through, what kind of research design would be needed to do that in the best way.
So there's a question in the chat room, Jeff. It says that you presented data on LGBT youth and suicide, but they were interested if you had data that looked at transgender youth.
Yes, and again, and I would say that those estimates of suicidal thoughts and behaviors for transgender youth would be similar to youth who would identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Those studies are not, there aren't as many of those studies that are published, but the few that are, that's a pretty consistent finding. One thing that I think National Violent Death Reporting System can help us with over time is that questions of sexual identity, sexual orientation have been added, are now included in NVDRS, which may help us to understand a little bit more about circumstances of suicide among sexual minority youth. So there could be some more information coming down the line, especially as the thing with NVDRS is there's always a lag in terms of when new data elements are added and then when restricted access data are released. And so hopefully in the next couple years, there would be, we'd be able to look at those types of questions specific to suicide.
Another question is, will you be monitoring the pandemic-related mental health issues, and suicide?
Great question. So I think the answer to that is there are a lot of people that will be looking at those associations. And just like within many of our hospital systems, I know here at Nationwide Children's, I'm aware of this at numerous hospitals across the country, is that presentations to our emergency departments have increased dramatically since COVID with mental health related concerns, including suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And so there is a real concern that when mortality data become available, that we're going to see these associations with higher rates of suicide associated with COVID. But I would just say almost everything related to COVID and mental health, it's one of those areas where for some of these issues, there tend to be one or two teams that are looking at the questions. For this, I think we're going to have, this will be addressed from multiple perspectives, which will be wonderful for the field.
Let's see, we have a couple more questions. I think we have some time. Have you had an opportunity to look at the impact of the 13 Reasons Why series on non-suicidal self-inflicted injury among youth?
Thank you for that question. We have not. So the issue with non-suicidal self-injury is if you were going to look at that nationally, it's really hard to find the right data. If somebody's aware of it, I would love to know about it. But if you were to use, let's just say CDC data on non-fatal self-harm presentations to emergency departments, I'm assuming you could get a restricted access data that would have either daily or monthly rates, although it is a sample as opposed to mortality data, which is the whole population. So there would be some sampling issues there. To my knowledge, the CDC doesn't tease out whether the self-harm was, whether there's suicide intent or it was non-suicidal self-injury. And so there may be a way to do something if you had access to some codes, some ICD codes. But that could be, again, part of it is the quality of reporting, how accurately our emergency department personnel across the country reporting on non-suicidal self-injury. And I think that's where that self-harm indicator comes in, because it's more of an all-encompassing bucket that includes both non-suicidal and suicidal self-injury.
And we have one other question here. It has to do with the reporting of data. It's really a comment, but maybe you could add your thoughts to this. It says questions on sexual orientation and gender identity are also included in child death review reporting. However, investigations by law enforcement and coroners' offices into youth suicides are sorely lacking this information. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that statement?
I would agree with that statement. The challenge would be, I think, as far as reporting from law enforcement and what information can become available in narratives to help us understand deaths, I would be a complete advocate for more systematic capture of data of this information, of other types of information, because as somebody that's gone through hundreds of child death reviews as they appear in National Violent Death Reporting, which is a little different than child fatality review, the quality of the narrative is all over the map. And if there could be a minimum standard that we have for the field, I think that would really help as far as drilling down and understanding some of the contextual factors that are associated with suicide.
Well, great. Jeff, I want to thank you for coming today and presenting to us. I just want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and will be available on MIPA's website. And the other thing I was going to say, if you're not a member of MIPA, the Midwest Injury Prevention Alliance, we'd love to have you join if you're in Federal Region 5. There's 6 states in that region. And if you're in that one of those states and want to be part of MIPA, we have not only webinar series, we have an annual meeting, we have newsletters that go out, we have committees working in various areas, including in things like violent death and drug overdose, adult falls, child injury, and so forth. So if you folks are interested, please join. You can go to the Midwest Injury Prevention website and you can join us there. If you go into the chat room, our website URL has just been placed there. But thank you so much, Jeff. Fantastic presentation, very informative. And so thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.